Welcome to Word Made Print, an exhibition in the Knight Library's Special Collection and in University Archives to mark the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. I'm Vera Keller, an Associate Professor of History in the Clark Honors College, and I had the privilege of co-curating this exhibition with my colleague in history, David Lupke. And we also partnered with faculty in Northwest Christian University, including Steve Silver, who also has an exhibition in Kellenberger Library. Today we're going to take a brief tour of some of the jewels of the collection that illustrate the way that the print revolution worked alongside the Protestant Reformation. Few historical events have touched so many lives around the world, whether Christian or not, as the Protestant Reformation, as well as the print revolution. These two global events went hand in hand. While historians today question whether Martin Luther really did pin the manuscript of his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg in 1517, there is no doubt that those theses were printed and spread like wildfire across the German-speaking lands and eventually around the globe. So looking at these two events together allows us to see how social movements as well as communications technology work hand in hand in creating earth-shattering historical events. And we're so lucky to have so many jewels here in the special collections and university archives to illustrate just this point. This vitrine here shows 3 books that we selected to mark the leap between the printed world and the world of the manuscript. Before the Reformation, one of the central places where manuscripts were produced was within institutions of the Catholic Church, such as monasteries. This meant that with the dissolution of monasteries, for example, in England, suddenly the center of book productions was demolished. England, for example, was littered with manuscripts taken from destroyed monasteries. Scraps of medieval manuscripts flooded the market. And in this one printed book, we can see the worlds being bridged here between the medieval monastic manuscript and the new Protestant printed book, because this little medieval scrap of a manuscript was used in the very construction to help with the binding of this translation of the Sermons of John Calvin, printed in London in 1583. So it is a visual reminder to us of the destruction of an old way of producing books, the monastic scriptoria, and the way that all of these scraps of manuscripts were floating around and used literally to cut and paste into new printed volumes. Yet the emergence of print did not mean that the way that people related to books was purely through print. Of course, print and manuscript still worked hand in hand. So we could see a wonderful example of that through the tradition of family Bibles, such as this New Testament that was printed in London in 1610, shortly before the introduction of the King James Bible, which would be printed by, in fact, the same printer in London. So we can see in this book copious annotations from a family that kept its records. If we go all the way back to the back of the book, we could see, for example, Alice Garnett, born on the 6th of June, 1692. And throughout the book, different notes of family history. For example, our dear son, William Garnett, was seized with violent fever on the 22nd day of January, 1771. And it continued exceeding till the 31st of January, Thursday, 1771, which morning proved fatal to our dear sweet lamb about 8 o'clock in the morning. So all of these births and deaths and marriages that are marked within this book make it into a family archive. And of course, this was a widespread practice for family Bibles. But we have to remember that it's print that made books available enough and cheap enough such that families could have a family Bible like this and have this enduring legacy that clearly this one family was recording their history in here for over a century. Another form of an archive we can see in this manuscript over here to the right, which we have included as an example of some really beautiful monastic manuscript production. And I like the way that, for example, the dove at the top indicating the Holy Spirit relates to the title of our exhibition as a whole. Word made print, of course, refers to word made flesh, the idea of the incarnation of the Spirit as indicated through the dove. And it is really speaking to the importance of the idea of the logos or the word in the way that Christianity has always related to texts, and how that relationship to text is therefore transformed once that word is enclosed in a new medium, in print. Here we still are in a beautiful manuscript medium. You can see all sorts of illusionistic tools being used here to portray, for example, strawberries and gems and pearls and jewels, cameo jewels, and even a little caterpillar and beetle over here, really showcasing some of the famed miniature art of illumination, of which we have several other examples in the collection. What this manuscript is, it's really the archive of the Benedictine monastery of San Zeno in Verona. And it collects all the different privileges, all the different rights given to the monastery over the course of its history, going back centuries. And you could see from some of the Marginalia in it that it was actually used as an archive, that people went back to it over time in order to answer questions about what rights the monastery had been granted by different political powers. And this manuscript, which is prepared on vellum rather than paper, as many manuscripts are, has in the back prepared lined sheets of vellum, because they expected this to be a continuing archive going into the future. And you can see in both Italian and Latin, new information, new correspondence with the Doges of Venice was filled in into this manuscript. And besides for illustrating a beautiful example of monastic scribal arts, what this manuscript also shows is how the Reformation relates to the relationship between politics and religion. That the Reformation, as well as being a social movement, is also a political movement, that the rights of these monasteries depended upon their relationship with various political powers. And with the Reformation, those relationships were all renegotiated. And so that's another theme that we're going to explore in some of the other vitrines in the exhibition. So in this vitrine, we really wanted to look at the issue of scale and what difference scale makes. So you could look at images of this on your computer screen at home, but to come into the library and actually look at the real object, you really get a sense of how this thing is in space and how it relates to you as in your body and to the building in which it would have once been. So for example, this is a humongous leaf of parchment. And it would not have been something that you just read cozily at home. This is a choir book. It is used in a church for a lot of people to use at once. So that you have one book which is written in a large enough hand that all the choir boys can look over and read it together. It's a chant, actually a chant for Christmas morning. Dominus regnavit decorum induit. The Lord has clothed himself in strength. And I also like the fact that the text of this, which comes from Psalm 93, indicates another issue with manuscript, and that is that every time you copy a manuscript, you're really playing a game of telephone, that small variations will be introduced every time you copy it. So when I looked up this text in the Psalms, I noticed that today, officially, if you look at the text, it's considered Dominus regnavit decorum indutus est. It's a different tense in Latin. And when you look at the different texts of this chant that circulate, sometimes you see it one way, sometimes you see it the other way. So this kind of fluctuation in what the actual text of the Bible said is an aspect of a manuscript culture. One of the arguments that's been put forward, for example, by Elizabeth Eisenstein in the Print Revolution, is that the effect that print had was to fix texts, because instead of copying one manuscript many, many, many times over and introducing errors each time, with print you can print a run of hundreds or thousands and therefore really minimize the chances of making a mistake. And so text helps us stabilize, helps to be stabilized within print. Looking further down here, we can see the other extreme of the sense of scale that you would feel if you came to look at the manuscript in person at the library, because these beautifully illuminated manuscripts from the 15th and the 14th centuries are not meant for communal usage in a large space. These are meant for individual devotion. These are leaves from books of hours, which celebrate the life of the Virgin Mary, and which are a major genre for individual devotion within Catholicism, and often where some of the most beautiful illuminations of manuscripts that we have come from. So here we have another example of a beautiful book of hours from our collection, meant for private devotion and therefore smaller in format, and an even smaller book really meant to be held in an individual person's hand, called the Hortulus Animae, the Little Garden of the Soul. It's not technically a book of hours, but it's similar because it's meant for private devotion. And what the Little Garden of the Soul does is it offers prayers that you could say that might help win you years spent otherwise in purgatory. So it relates to that idea of indulgences and getting out of purgatory that was one of the main issues for Protestant reformers in their relationship to the Catholic Church. So this little book of the soul is particularly interesting to me because it looks a lot like a manuscript. In fact, it is illuminated. We've got wonderful little scenes over here, but it's not a manuscript. It's printed. And they even worked to burnish the paper, and they even used vellum for the very first page of this book so that it would look like a manuscript. So that shows how when print was first invented, it wasn't seen as something so desirable that you wanted to have a book that looked radically different from a manuscript. What you wanted was a cheaper manuscript. And so they tried to make these books that still looked like manuscripts and functioned like manuscripts. So for the first couple of decades, stretching into the early 16th century, this book is printed in 1510, you'll see texts that are really masquerading as manuscripts, even as they are printed, and therefore benefit from those advantages that print confers, like much cheaper book production, able to reach a much wider market. Over here, we're looking at another great example of the relationship between print and manuscript, because we're looking at a printed version and a manuscript version of the same text. These are the decretals. And these are the main texts that a law student might use to study canon laws. So it's the laws of the Catholic Church. And we can see this book is the manuscript, and this book is the print, although they are laid out in a very similar fashion. So you can see that those techniques don't change right away, but other aspects of how this book was produced and used are radically different. The way this book would have been produced would have been to actually rent out small sections of it, small pieces of it, from a kind of a master text in, say, a university town like Paris. If you're a law student at Paris in the 15th century and you needed a textbook, you went to the person who was renting out pieces of the text, and you took home a piece and you copied it, and then you returned it and you got the next piece of the text and you copied that. And you can really see that this book was not all produced at the same time. If we flip through it and look at the changes of the colors of the ink, they're very dramatic. Sometimes we have the very dark ink in the commentary around, sometimes a light ink in the main block of the text, and here it's totally reversed. We have dark in the middle and light in the back. That's just one indication that this book was produced in many pieces over a period of time as some student was copying it for their use. Imagine if you had to produce your university textbooks today by hand copying it yourself. At least this system, the piece system or the Pacia system, was very efficient because it allowed you to have one text, one manuscript exemplar, being used to produce multiple texts at the same time as group by group, chapter by chapter, different portions of the text were rented out. This book would have been produced all at the same time, all printed at once. And it's on paper, not on vellum or prepared animal skin. As is typical, most printed texts print on paper rather than vellum because the ink sinks better into paper than into vellum. Early printed books, they tried printing on vellum. It wasn't a great idea. The vellum is a big expense. Imagine preparing all of those animals skins for usage. But it's not as big as we might think it would be if you think about monasteries as the place where a lot of manuscripts were produced. Monasteries which also own farms with sheep and also have kind of unpaid scribes in the form of monks. So with an efficient monastic production of texts, the use of, say, scribes or vellum isn't as expensive as it might have been in another setting. But once we aren't in a monastery anymore, it quickly becomes much, much more expensive. Print introduces a whole other business model of producing a book. Now you have a business person, a printer, often families of printers, sometimes including women, such as the widows and wives and daughters of printers who carry on the businesses. And these people are really entrepreneurs, and they have to make profit-oriented decisions about what books to print because they're printing on speculation. They're not producing a manuscript one at a time for a client that they know wants a manuscript. They're producing it hundreds of times. So they have to know, okay, I'm going to lay out the money to get all the paper ahead of time that I need to print this entire book. And paper, for the beginning of print, was really the most expensive part of producing the book, not the work of the author, who wouldn't really be paid anything in cash at all. We can see through the wonderful Marginalia. I love these little images. This guy is eating, it looks like a bunch of grapes, and all the different notes throughout this book, that even after print, of course, people are still reading with their quill in hand, making manuscript annotations, which we call Marginalia, around the book, and really getting to know the book by marking it up in this way with these things that look like doodles to us, that very often are ways to find your way through the text. In early books, you don't have things like page numbers or indices to help you find your way around the text. Here we have the names of different chapters of the book, but there's no page numbers. So how do you figure out your way through the text? Well, one way is to really read it intensively and to make all these scribbles so that you kind of get to memorize the text, as it were, and you can find your way around. I love this particular one of the Pope, who's described as being the Pope here, and we can see the papal tiara that he's wearing on top of his head. With this text, we get fewer marginalia, but considering that the student had to write the text themselves, they probably were pretty familiar with the text by the time they were done producing the book. So we talked about the problems faced by a printer with producing a large book that requires an outlay of, say, a lot of paper, the use of a lot of type. But one of the most interesting phenomena that print allowed was the production of very, very, very thin works, pamphlets. These cheap prints really spread the words of a movement like the Reformation. And they're precious to historians because very often pamphlets like this is a very, very thin pamphlet from 1524 by a work of one of the major reformers, Philip Melanchthon, don't survive as easily as some of the bigger books that would have sat more comfortably on a bookshelf. But these are so important in terms of spreading a movement. They're really the means through which the Reformation was made to go viral in the 16th century. These tiny little prints, sometimes just one sheet, which we call a broadsheet, that could spread the message quickly. And as we can see here in vernacular, this is unlike the books of hours that we just looked at or the legal textbooks. Those were in Latin, and this right here is in German. So it shows how the Reformation was really geared at reaching a wide German-speaking, that means vernacular-speaking audience who may not have been able to read a text written in the language of learning in Latin. And here we've got some examples of another thing that the print spread for the Reformation, and that was the image of the reformer. If you think about it, it's not so easy before the introduction of mass media like print to spread the image of a celebrity. You have coins, often used to spread the images of rulers, say, but how do you spread the image and make known the persona of the leader of a social or religious movement like Martin Luther was for the Reformation? Print really allowed these faces to become iconic household names. And we could see how they really get stereotyped and reproduced en masse if we compare, for example, this image of Martin Luther and this much later one, which is reversed. Very often when you see a print that has been reversed, you know that it was copied from a previous exemplar because images get reversed in the printing process. That means that an image of Luther like this, for example, could have been drawn and then cut as a woodblock or, as in this case, engraved, and then it would have appeared reversed in the printing process. So we can see this dissemination of the Reformer's image in multiple mass media, both engraving here and woodblock print over here. One of the really interesting features of Martin Luther's persona as it was disseminated in print was, in fact, his own volume. We just talked about the volume of books. Now we're going to talk about the volume of Martin Luther, known as the Stout Doctor. What's fascinating about that is that in the early days of the Reformation, images of Martin Luther were circulated, and he looked like an ascetic monk. He looked a lot like his colleague, Philip Melanchthon, who wrote that pamphlet that we had looked at, who is quite ascetic looking. We can see some examples, maybe Melanchthon a little bit later. Let's see if we have any images of Melanchthon in here. Let's see. No, I'll have to find it for us later. Oh, here we go. Here's Melanchthon. So we compare Melanchthon, our ascetic-looking reformer, with our rather corpulent Martin Luther. We see a difference. And what's interesting about it is that originally Martin Luther was made to look a lot more like Philip Melanchthon. Until the 1530s, when a new image of Martin Luther started circulating, which was more realistic, and also it offered an image of a different type of religious figure, rather than a monk who retreats from the world, who is celibate, who does not marry, who does not relate to the rest of society, and therefore has that asceticism reflected in his own physicality. This kind of stouter Martin Luther that started to be disseminated in the 1530s showed someone who was married, who had children, who talked about his body all the time, who was relating to the common man, and who was really trying to see himself as part and parcel of society, rather than as someone who has elected to be separate from it. And the imagery that it drew upon, this new, more corpulent Martin Luther, was really the imagery of secular rulers rather than figures within the church, who had often been shown as being kind of large and, bulky. And we have an example of that here when we take a look at this image, which was shown in many of Martin Luther's publications, showing Martin Luther on one side of the crucifix, and on the other side is one of his allied political leaders. And if you looked at the two of them and you wouldn't know which one was the religious leader and which one was the political leader, because they are really hanging like counterweights on either side of the crucifix. This particular volume, which we have loaned from the Kellenberger Library at Northwest Christian University, is the book of Table Talk of Martin Luther. It is supposedly the things that he casually said over dinner and that were collected and printed after his death. And it's another wonderful example of the way that print was used to relate a whole persona, not just how he actually looked in the flesh, but what he was saying over dinner with his friends and colleagues to a wide German-speaking population. Print was used to get the message out about the movement of the Reformation, and that included writing the history of the movement and telling the story of what was going on in the many battles and political fights that were being waged all across Europe. And this is one of the more important texts that tells the contemporary history of the movement. But the Reformation also used print to tell a much wider historical story. This is just one volume of the Magdeburg Centuries. It's called the Magdeburg Centuries because a whole group of reformers in the city of Magdeburg sat down and collectively wrote the history of the church century by century. So this is volumes 8 and 9, the 8th and 9th century of the history of the church. And the reason they did this was because they saw the Reformation not as a new innovation, but as a return to the past, as going back to the primitive era of the Catholic Church. And they argued that the Catholic Church had introduced many new innovations. And so step by step through centuries, they wanted to show what had been added or distorted about Christianity by the papacy. And so a very, very learned text in Latin that made this case historically, whereas here we have a contemporary text in the vernacular that tells contemporaries what is going on all around them. Another example of a contemporary history of the Reformation is here Gilbert Burnet's History of the Reformation of the Church of England, where we have a wonderful image showing the building of superstition being destroyed while the new religion is being built up as a new building. And here we also have an image of destruction on the left, the dissolution of the monasteries that were destroyed by the order of King Henry VIII standing above them. And we can see the Pope's supremacy, his tiara, lying at the feet of King Henry VIII, who decided to ignore the papal claim to supremacy over him and to take control of his own church and his country. And so this image, which once again balances a somewhat realistic image of a reformer, here Cardinal Wolsey, against a political figure, shows us the political nature of the Reformation, that it includes a political fight, for example, with the papacy. So of course, writing this kind of polemical history is a matter of furious debate, and it's often fun to look inside these books to see what contemporaries thought about some of the historical claims that were being made. And in pencil here, one reader has written copiously throughout this book, erroneous, 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 not agreeing with the version of history that Gilbert Burnet has been setting forth. So one of the chief ways that the pairing of the Protestant Reformation and the print revolution has affected the world that we still live in today is the rise of vernacular languages. Given that the Bible still remains today the global bestseller and is one of the most influential books ever penned, it's really significant that the Reformation meant that Bibles are being translated into the various vernacular languages, therefore giving those languages that hadn't been used for those kinds of authoritative text usually much greater status, and also helping to set those languages, helping to clarify spelling and grammar, that when those languages were used as spoken languages were really rather idiosyncratic. And so the form of many modern languages today, including English, German, and French, have really been influenced by the ways that those languages were used in translations of the Bibles that were so widely read and disseminated. So here we have a 1551 English translation of the New Testament, a French Genevan version from 1588, and as well as a Dutch translation. And these are just a handful of the many wonderful Bibles in our collection, and even more Bibles are on display at Northwest Christian University. So the Protestant Reformation, along with the Catholic Church's response to it, which we often call the Catholic or the Counter-reformation, helped to clarify what doctrine was for both the Protestant movements and the Catholic Church. And this meant clarifying who didn't belong to various movements, including this catalog of heretics being laid out in this work printed in London in 1654, where all sorts of different religious figures are being identified almost as a species. Here we have the Anabaptist, the Familist, the Jesuit, the Antinomian, the Seeker, and my favorite, the Divorcer, who are not appropriate members of the church. And their only choices are either repentance and returning to the church, symbolized by this figure on a rock, or destruction. Scenes of destruction and violence were one way that the reformers really spread the message about the Catholic Church's violent response to their movement. And John Foxe's Book of Martyrs was one of the most widely read and dramatic accounts of the various scenes, such as 7 godly murders burned in Coventry. So along with allowing this kind of graphic reportage of the destruction of reformers and heretics, print also allowed for the spread of the images of various religious leaders, not just the ones that came to be accepted as part of the mainstream and leaders of their movements, like Martin Luther, but those who are rejected, such as John of Leyden, also could become household names by having their portraits spread through print. So here's a little book of devotion. As you can see, it easily fits into a hand. This is another little text of a Garden of the Soul. This one is in Spanish, but it's printed in France in 1560, and there's a very good reason for that. The Catholic response to the Reformation, known as the Counter-reformation or the Catholic Reformation, meant not only clarifying what doctrine was, but using print, just like the Reformers had, as a tool. The Catholic Reformation used printing as a way to make sure that the same kinds of texts that had been authorized by them, that had been approved by the Office of the Index, whose job it was to go through books and look for any signs of heresy, would be produced and reach their flock. And so through a decree, the printing of Spanish books like this, the little books of the soul in Spanish, had actually been forbidden in Spain, and which is why this little text is rare and had to be produced in France. So while the Catholic Reformation or Counter-reformation's effort to control print might have taken away some business opportunities from some printers, it afforded amazing opportunities for other printers who were able to negotiate with the church for some exclusive rights to produce the works that had been approved by the church. And one such printer was Christoph Plantin of Antwerp in the southern Netherlands. I'm going to put this book down and show you how similar it is to another little book of the soul that was printed by Plantin, who was able to gain the privilege to print these books and to print, in fact, all of the books and the rest of this vitrine are all printed by Plantin and his descendants, often in deluxe editions. This one, for example, has on the cover the arms of the crown of Portugal, and it comes supplied with these beautiful green silk ribbons that allow you to keep your place in the text. As you can see, it's known as the Rituale Romanum, which had been edited by command of the Pope, printed in Antwerp out of the Plantin press by his in-laws, the Moretises. And it includes, in addition to musical notation and different prayers to be said, sometimes wonderful images. This edition of the Office of the Holy Virgin Mary, also printed in Antwerp out of the Plantin press, is a showcase of the Plantin press's abilities to negotiate for rights to print a text, and also to negotiate with a large stable of some of the foremost artists of the time. It's filled with beautiful, beautiful images designed by famous artists, and here in this deluxe edition, hand-colored in the period throughout. These images would be hugely influential in the spread of the Catholic missionary movement around the globe. If you look at some visual arts, for example, throughout South America, you can often point to the relationship between painting, between tapestries, between manuscripts, and some of the iconic imagery that is really giving a new visual language of the Catholic Church to be used around the globe that can be found in deluxe and authorized books like this. So this text celebrates the spread of Catholic Christianity around the globe. It features on the title page the arms of the worldwide Habsburg monarchy, these two columns, which were a reference to the columns of Hercules that, according to the ancients, were placed at the Straits of Gibraltar and marked with the sign, no further. Meaning that one could not navigate past that point. Well, plus ultra, further, was the motto adopted by the Habsburg emperors in their quest to become the emperors of the world. And they succeeded to a large extent in this period due to their inroads in Asia and in the Americas. This text makes the case that, in fact, the Catholic Church had gotten to the New World very early, as it has an account of travels by a monk from the 5th century with some incredible details of what supposedly happened in this voyage, such as Mass being celebrated on the back of a whale in this particular image. But it also has accounts of more contemporary encounters, or at least visual imagery that would have reminded readers of some contemporary encounters, such as many of the accounts of the cannibals to be faced in the New World. So you might be surprised to find in a work with such dubious claims to authenticity images like this, showing some of the New World exciting botanicals, such as potatoes or the sunflower. But science and the study of the New World was one of the tools that the Catholic Church used in its reach around the globe. This book over here, the work of the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, is a wonderful example about how the spread of global Christianity through the Catholic Counter-reformation really created new networks of information exchange of all sorts, not just concerning religion. The Jesuit movement, which was specifically founded to counter the Reformation, sent its missionaries around the globe and created a network that sent back all sorts of information, including information about what we might call the anthropology of the various residents. Here we see the different clothing worn by different people in different provinces throughout China. We also have information about local architectural monuments or the current religious practices in the region and the gods of the region, as well as information about the natural world that one might encounter, such as pineapples or different animals, such as these wonderful birds or monkeys, or the hippopotamus, looking rather fierce over here. So it might be surprising to modern audiences to see a work which is devoted to the spread of the Catholic Reformation contain within it so much scientific material. But science was really the vector by which these texts gained so much of their strength and spread, both across a European audience who is eager for this kind of first-hand account about difficult-to-access regions, as well as to audiences abroad who also wanted access to European forms of science. And so a wonderful example of that is the way that Jesuits, like Adam Schall here, were offered access to the Chinese court in order to serve as astronomers, in order to bring the latest in European science to China. And this scientific advantage that they were able to offer got them a step in the door religiously. So thank you so much for joining me in our walk through our exhibition, Word Made Print, Special Collections and University Archives exhibit to honor the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. What we looked at is just a small fraction of the riches of the collection, and I really hope you come in person one day soon to take a look at some more. Thanks.